Good evening and welcome all to what must be the absolute high point of the Holberg Week, where this year's winner of the Holberg Prize, Achille Mbembe, research professor of history and politics at the Wits Institute of Social and Economic Research at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and this year's winner of the Nils Klim Prize, Professor Siddharth Sareen, professor of energy and environment in the Department of Media and Social Sciences at the University of Stavanger, actually get to speak together. My name is Kari Jegerstedt, and I have the great honor of moderating this conversation. And I will begin briefly by introducing our two laureates in a bit, but only a bit more detail. I will do so not by recounting their excellence in number of positions, prizes, and publications, all of which are numerous, but simply by quoting from the Holberg Prize press release from when their prizes were announced earlier this year. So, Mbembe, they write, is one of the most read and cited scholars from the African continent and receives the prize for his pioneering research in African history, post-colonial studies, humanities, and social sciences for over 4 decades. He is both one of the foremost thinkers of post-colonial Africa, addressing issues such as the production of race and racism, and a key critical theorist of the planetary. Both as an academic and as a public intellectual, he is known for his ability to bridge existing thinking on colonialism and decolonization with pressing questions on topics such as contemporary migration regimes, global citizenship, restitution and reparation, technology, climate change, and planetary futures. In the course of his remarkable career, they write of Sareen has established himself as a creative researcher and academic supervisor, especially given the range of his research topics, broadly covering governance of energy transitions of varying scales and in different environments. These topics involve the intricacies of sustainability and accountability, energy history, environmental justice, urban and non-urban geography, democratic grounding, and social inclusion. His work is exemplary for the global importance of critical and interactive relationships between fields of scholarship, technology, and industry in the vital search for renewable and sustainable sources of energy. And yeah, congratulations to both of you and welcome so much. It is a real pleasure to have you here. The announced topic for today's or tonight's conversation is pretty broad, to say the least, or so it says in the program. You are here to talk about your research, your experiences, and your thoughts about important issues in contemporary society. I am really tempted, however, to narrow the angle a little bit. Earlier today, namely, some of us had the pleasure to listen to each of your symposiums, where each of you had invited distinguished researchers to discuss a topic of your own choice. So you, Mbembe, or may I call you Achille, had chosen the topic democracy as a community of life, and you, Sareen, or Sid, had chosen the topic reflect and act, energy, social science, and impact. The topics might at the outset sound quite different, but it came rather obvious to all of us who were there that they are intrinsically intertwined. It is impossible to talk about community and democracy today without discussing the vast challenges of climate change, loss of biodiversity, and climate injustice. Likewise, it is impossible to discuss reflection and action in relation to clean and sustainable energy without discussing democracy and community, which is a fact also which is quite aptly summed up by the title of one of the invited speakers to Sid's symposium, Andy Sterling, which had the title Transform Energy, ? Transform Society, ! So tonight I thought it is your opportunity to bring these topics from earlier today together. And I will do my best to set you going, and hereby announce that the main topic tonight will be the relation between thinking and doing, theory and action, when it comes to thinking a just and sustainable world. Nothing less. Before we get to do that, however, I would like to point out another less obvious similarity of the ways you are doing your research and engaging in academia. A similarity that I find actually quite apt for this setting, the House of Literature, namely literature. And literature came up quite often in your symposium earlier today, Achille. And when I spoke to you yesterday, you had several references to and thoughts about how literature is a specific way of thinking that brings a very specific form of knowledge into view, very often before scientists reach the exact same knowledge. And you might probably not know this, but when Sid lived in Bergen, he took active part in the International Book Club here at the Literature House, a book club that I, in fact, lead. So I have had many discussions about literature with Sid earlier, and I can attest that he always brought profound insights into the group. It was not until a couple of days ago, however, that I learned that Sid writes poetry himself, and that he often disseminates his research or writes abstracts for his articles in the form of poems. So I have asked him to open this conversation for us by reading one of his poems, and then perhaps you, Achille, can follow up and say something about how literature might help us to think about democracy, community, climate, energy, and the earth. Welcome.
I have the easier task.
Oh, you will have to say more after that.
So I was grateful that Kari asked yesterday. I didn't get a chance to print it, but I did get a chance to write it 6 years ago. And listening to you and the symposium yesterday, I thought this was perhaps the appropriate one to pick to start the task of bringing our conversations together. I wrote it just having returned from Seattle in the autumn of 2018 to Bergen. So there's a couple of references to things that refer to that. The case for hope amidst climate change catastrophe. Is hope apocalyptic after all? Does it let us wait, twiddling our thumbs in between bursts of furious activity? Do we find kindred spirits in our search for salvation and think we are closer to accomplishment, when in fact loss follows loss? Wildfires burn, countries drown, species disappear. Or would that be an unkind misconstrual? Do times like this render us in need of friends, now more than ever? Is compassion our mast, hope our guiding star, and empathy, born of friendship, the wind in our gutsy sails? Who loses? What prevails? We fought for Initiative 1631, the Pacific Northwest, the first frontier of hope, for change to a politics of trying, of recognizing what times call on us to do, to make polluters pay, to compensate victims of fossil fuels, and give a chance to an energy sector powered by renewables in the here and now, rather than a decade hence. But big oil poured in millions, money talked and people listened. The initiative took a beating. Opportunities are fleeting and it's already out of sight, out of mind, all that we must leave behind. No time to mope. The only way to cope is to return to hope. Or is it? Does hope motivate here in Seattle's sister city, connected by a totem pole down at Nordnes in Bergen? Or does remoteness obfuscate while hope simply distracts, sustaining the unsustainable, regurgitating facts about 1.5 degrees while delaying acts that would keep it all in the ground, firmly under the sea, out around Lofoten, where our politics are floundering, much like Pacific Island states? What scope is there for hope when murder merely agitates, blinded by greed, a world that's rigged to keep expanding drilling? Pumped by oil, we grease the wheels and keep the coffers filling. Softly we murmur, we are better than others at not spilling. The most majestic icebergs thaw, glaciers are melting, New trade routes emerge as opportunity. That submerges hope. It is a more powerful motivator. What about the opportunity to save hundreds of millions, entire coastal cultures from submergence? When debate is anchored in opportunism, hope is reduced to a spectacle. We must defy and contest such imaginaries, call them out consistently as misleading hope mongers. Hope is not Janus-faced. It does not look away when counter-arguments are deposited. Hope rests in respectful judgment, in rooting for measured deliberation. With no respect, no room for basic dignity, no recognition of the right to life in all its fullness and diversity. It is apocalypse now. Channel hope to resist the dislocation that perpetuates fossil fuel hegemony and paves the way for regulation to depoliticize what is the most political thing of all. Our future, our here and now, the right to echo the call championed by Greta Thunberg. Hope is a tool to levy reasonable demands in unreasonable times, expecting power to yield to truth. We live in an apocalyptic moment that empathy and friendship help us recognize. Solidarity is our vessel of choice. And on these tumultuous waters, under cloudy skies, hope is our guiding star.
I think we could use a whole session in the literature club just talking about that. Thank you very much, Sid. That was really strong. Do you want to comment? I know it's a lot, but
no,
yeah.
but I want to hear more. Look, I mean, I was touched just listening to this poem, which basically was underlining a lot of what we were debating all day long during the first symposium and then the second, and which is asking exactly the same kinds of questions we were wrestling with. What time is it? And what name is it that we give to this time? Is it the time of the apocalyptic, which, as we know, basically refers to the end of times? I mean, the apocalypse, that's what it is. In any case, in the biblical tradition, the apocalypse announces the end of time. Or is it that, in fact, the apocalyptic is tussling, so to say, with hope? This extraordinary category, which is also of the order, not really of the rational. Let's just use that term. It's not necessarily of the type of order we're talking about this afternoon. It's not evidence-based, or it goes beyond, let's say, the question of the evidence, although we need some science. It pertains to the domain of science, science of hope. And the way you introduce it here in the poem makes of it, in any case, that's how I understood it, in fact, not some passive thing we are waiting for, expecting it to happen in spite of us, or in any case, outside of our own agency, but something absolutely active, for which we commit ourselves, and which goes against a whole set of structures which exist, mentioning oil, greed, and which also requires some of what Paul was sharing with us this morning. He was talking about sympathy, in this case, compassion. And this question of sympathy and compassion, I guess we see it's with us right now. I'm not going to mention here the G word, but it's in all our minds. What has happened to compassion? What has happened to the neighbor, as Paul was putting it today? Who is our enemy? And how should we treat the enemy? And that's where I really want you to come to South Africa, because in South Africa in the 90s, these were precisely the key questions we were grappling with. Who is my neighbor? What do I do with my enemy? How do I deal with a stranger? In the long line of the orphan, the widow, which here again sends us back to the biblical tradition. So look, I'm absolutely delighted that we opened this conversation under that sign.
And there's so many places to follow up now, because I was also thinking, like, who is our enemy? Because that was also something that were discussed at the last symposium. Is it like we can talk about capitalism, or we can also talk about colonial modernity, which is a different kind of enemy. And I think there's so many other enemies we can talk about, and maybe we should come back to that. And I was also thinking empathy, sympathy, but you also used the word solidarity, which is a different kind of like world. But just let me ask, like, how is Apocalypse structuring the way you think about your research, or is it?
How is
the term apocalypse? Does it mean anything for you? I know it means something for you as a poet, but what does it mean for you as a scientist?
That's an interesting one. Okay. I think it probably means different things at different times. I think it's a place that one doesn't want to get to, but also a place that one never really gets to. It's more a way of signposting the need for reckoning, that we are on a course to somewhere and we need to reorient, that we're faced with odds that maybe hit somewhere with more immediacy than we necessarily feel ourselves. And that, to me, links with solidarity quite closely. It also reminds me of something you touched upon, Achille, in your remarks towards the end of your symposium, and that was something that I resonated very deeply with from having grown up in the Krishnamurti schools, about there not really being an other. There's no sort of violence out there, and we can fix it, and there's somebody there who's responsible, and they're the bad people. It's one world. And that can sound a bit wishy-washy or too fuzzy. I mean, there are people actively doing damage and others bearing the brunt. But I think the deeper point there is that if we don't form a larger tent within which we can all find out what it means to get along, what are the terms under which we can build a humanity that is inclusive, and not just a humanity, but a way of being in the world that is ethical and responsible. If we don't include a larger us in that, then we will be left with opposition and resisting something that's outside the tent, and that does something to the tent. It does this thing of being defined by the other, and that keeps us from finding ourselves. And that's a sort of apocalypse that's not an ending, it's just a continuing limbo. So I think that's probably worse.
Because I guess there's lots of people talking about climate change can't be avoided. And like a climate catastrophe, I mean, because climate change is happening all the time. It has happened for a while. But the catastrophe cannot be avoided. So actually, because you were talking now about like not getting to the apocalypse, but a lot of people say we will get to the apocalypse. The question is like, how do we deal with that afterwards? Do you agree with that, that that's another way of thinking about it? Or are you still having this hope that we will avoid the catastrophe?
Well, if one is in Gaza now, then one's experiencing it on our bodies, right? If we're not, then I think we have to sympathize, empathize, act, reflect on the conditions for how we can be in a world where that is somehow allowed, while we can still have conversations like this. So I'd say with more immediacy, my hometown last week was 47, 48 degrees Celsius, and other places where I've lived were over 50 degrees, and they're not particularly livable temperatures, especially when many people don't have housing or recourse to the kinds of things you need under that. So there is a different kind of immediacy to that, even though you're not there sort of in person. Yeah, yes, I'm curious. I'm curious about how you would respond to that.
No, but it's very interesting that we started with the apocalyptic, and then you introduced the catastrophic, and one might wonder, okay, what is the connection between the two? What engenders what? As you were speaking, I kept asking myself whether the apocalyptic or the catastrophic were of the order of, let's say, an event which happens, and then it has happened, and then we move on to another kind of era, epoch, or age. And then I was thinking that maybe in our long history, some have been experiencing with the catastrophic, not just as an event which has a beginning and end, but as sometimes a kind of endless process which goes on and keeps going on and on and on, morphing into other smaller ruptures and collisions and dislocations. And this has, of course, forced many to learn how to cope with the catastrophic, to develop over time, nurture those resources, cultivate those resources and capacities to cope with the extreme. And that may be, we are entering now an epoch when what used to happen to only some is becoming somewhat generalized. Or we are all now exposed somewhat to the catastrophic. Of course, not exactly in the same position. It will not cause exactly the same consequences. But it's no longer possible to build walls around us and outsource over there, far away, let's say the destruction that we have somewhat engineered, which forces us therefore to revisit, let's say, some of what we're talking about today. I mean, your points on colonialism, on capitalism, how it is that we rebuild what we have so severely damaged.
And what can we rebuild? I mean, if the catastrophe is really coming, we might be sitting, or we, some very few of us might be sitting in a world that is completely uninhabitable. As we know habitation, now we have to rethink habitation. So, I mean, we live in, now I saw something, I mean, but we do live in crazy times, in really, really urgent times, where we are facing a catastrophe. And at the same time, we're spending tons and tons on money, on militarization, on war, on fighting, on death. You're talking about like the death versus life world. How can we get, and which also, of course, then produces even more climate catastrophe because it's really pollution, bombs go off everywhere, killing people, but also destroying biodiversity, the environment. How did we get there, and how did we get out of it? I mean, how can you keep on doing like solar energy in a time like that? What keeps you up?
I think the fact that if we just let things happen, then they'll doubtless be worse. So solar energy is a good example where it's not just a good news story. It's cheaper, but things are cheaper based on several logics. Usually, part of it is discounting externalities that we don't like out of the costs, and that means not considering what kind of existing land use we're replacing, what cultural meanings landscapes have, what biodiversity is associated with them, and doing something that we like to do apparently called monoculturing. That's very much encouraged and promoted by most economic systems and kind of neoliberal capitalism as something that's a very pervasive entity, a way of structuring our society. So we displace based on investors from remote places who can channel large sums of capital into producing a lot of the same. And it now just happens to be cheap and less polluting, right, than something else like coal or oil or gas. And I think it's possible to do it in a much better way, to do it closer to places where there's energy demand, to do it for particular kinds of energy demand, to prioritize things that correspond with people's needs and not with sort of endless resource consumption in a world of limited resources, and not for sort of luxurious kinds of indulgences at the cost of quite basic services. And that's not what we see happening. So there are problems. We don't see lots of little pockets of clean energy production sensitive to existing meanings of land, existing uses, existing... not everything that exists is necessarily good, but a lot of it is. A lot of it is marked by continuity, by people having fought to safeguard things that we can so easily lose. And as you said, once you lose some things, they're really hard to build back. So there's meaning in those kinds of struggles, in solidarity with those who are not always in a position to speak up or have their voice heard, in projecting those voices, in taking forward those struggles, whether it's through financial aid or through mutuality in some form, and by also preempting the same kind of patterns from rolling out and making one large uniform carpet of the whole world where 5 people end up owning it and they all look the same and they sit far away from any of the effects of what they've perpetrated. And that starts in particular places. It doesn't start in national and global scale decisions. It starts with a few people in a room deciding to do something and figuring out how they'll get away with it. So we have to get into those rooms. We have to cast light into them. We have to challenge that and have people, whether it's out on the streets or whether it's in public debate and taking over the newspaper pages or social media feeds, we have to change the conversation.
But can green energy solve the problem?
To a limited extent, depending on how we understand the problem. The problem is not simply runaway greenhouse gas emissions. It's one part of the problem. The problem is social inequality. The problem is exploitative, extractive, commodified ways of living in the world and dealing with the resource base that we could all be sharing. So scarcity is sort of a created problem for us as the world and people in it, and it's created by, I guess, some very weird tendency that attracts us in different ways to accumulate and acquire and say it's mine, 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 my garden with a trampoline, not my child playing in the public park. My car with, seats that warm themselves and not just a better bus system. It's not attractive to me, so I'm not sure that I'm best positioned to say why, but I certainly think it's curious and it's unfortunate, and that we should be discussing it and trying to understand it and unbundle it and make it have less of a hold in our collective psyche.
Do you think green energy can save the world?
No, but look, I have the feeling that, we could get out of it. For instance, in South Africa, where we live, of course, the figures vary constantly. We're told, rates of unemployment vary between 36% and 40% of the population, around 60 million people. So you have 60 million people, and we are told that at least between 36 and 40 are unemployed, are jobless. And then you go to the CBD in Johannesburg, and lots of people on the pavement. Many people are busy doing something. Clearly, the official description of what unemployment is does not necessarily square with the sociological observation that people are busy somewhere doing something which produces some form or another of value, which then can be converted into money. And this you see even more so in cities in West Africa. Accra, Ato is here, Lagos, in Nigeria, Abidjan, Dakar, or for that matter, Kinshasa, where there is no industrial structure, so to say, to absorb the surplus population. Although extractive industries, including those that are dealing with the rare minerals, without which we wouldn't even be here today, are, of course, booming. And somebody somewhere is pocketing the profits and leaving behind a landscape of ruins and a toxic landscape, totally unlivable for those who are there right now and for generations to come. So you have that crisis of what it is that we mean by work or labor. What do we mean by that? What do we mean when we say people are unemployed? In fact, what we mean, without saying it explicitly, is that there is an inadequation between the economy and people's basic needs. We live under economic systems which are not providing for people's vital needs, which are what? House, water, clean water, food, education for the children, possibility to move. I mentioned that the right to mobility, which is absolutely key for some of us within the continent and over the world at large, that our history is one in which whenever we have been able to move, we have been forced to move in chains. So how do we make sure that at least in our own place we can move freely? All of that. So if we want to get out of the conundrum we find ourselves in, I think that we have to rescale the economy. Not only rescale the economy, but redefine the key matrices of what the economy is all about. What does it serve to? If it is not ordained to the cultivation of life forces, what is it for? What is its function? We have to go back to those key questions. And that's what partly I was hearing this afternoon when you were reinterrogating the very tenets of what knowledge is all about. What is evidence? Can we solve these issues purely and simply by collecting data, storing it, working on data, on information, and never go in really to the kernel of what is at stake, which is what, finally, a problem of meaning. So it seems to me that we have to go as deep as that. And in order to, let's say, walk in those territories, we will need not really a supplement. That's where we started with a poem. We'll need to draw from the variety of resources out of which some new forms of intelligence can be crafted. And we'll have to open all the archives of the entire world. And therefore, if you want me to use a term that is, we need to decolonize, but really in the deepest sense of the term, not in the as a compensatory type of. So that's what I think.
But decolonize and decolonize knowledge. But do you also think now, if I hear you right, decolonize economy?
Oh, definitely.
And
That's
how?
what I was alluding to. As long as there is this gap between the economy and life forms, we have to reconnect the economic and the vital life, le vivant. I don't know how you say it in English, but in French, it is le vivant, which means, as Siddharth was alluding to, not just us meaning we humans, but the whole of the creation.
Vitality.
Yes.
The earthly community. But how do we get there? I mean, because I think one thing is like knowledge production and scientists and invention and innovation and stuff like that. But another aspect of this is activism. Because you present yourself both as a scientist and an activist in a certain sense. Can you say something about the relationship between science and activism, and also maybe the relationship between science and activism to truth? Because that was another thing that came up today. What is truth? How do we talk about truth today? Yeah, I tend to make these questions really big, but
I think my way into academia has been through wanting to work with and towards social and environmental equity and justice, and the analytical and writing and speaking skills and so on are all at the service of that. And I think that if you break down what an activist is, it's somebody who's acting in line with particular convictions or ideals or ambitions, right? That's, I think, perfectly compatible with being an academic. I think there's additional layers you can place on that. Part of it is the tools of the trade. So there's methodological training, there's skills you acquire. But what is truth? I don't think that that's even simply a scientific question. I think that's an existential question. Who are we? Why are we here? So when I was, in the last bit of my teenage, which is when in India, growing up, you're very pressured to define what you're going to be for the rest of your life, and probably should have been working towards it for a few years already. Then I did my best to defy that and not get squeezed into some kind of box, because I was so curious about the world. And part of it, I think, comes from, so almost, if I hadn't gone into the social sciences, the closest thing on my list was theoretical physics. I just realized you spend 10 years in training before you get to even starting on some of the interesting questions. And I don't mean that in just because the three of us who spoke a lot together in high school, the other two became physicists, and one of them was cited by Stephen Hawking before he passed away. So I was very close to doing that. But I think that's not necessarily, truth is not something that we get closer to through training and skills and scientific rigor. I think it's something that's as much an internal inquiry as an external one.
Yeah, and I maybe was thinking also that there are different kinds of truth. There are a scientific truth, like a truth in scientific endeavors that are completely different from truth in politics, for example. That there are, and I was also thinking this debate about like activism and science, because when you then explain how your role of activist in science is thought, it's more kind of following good principles. In a way, in doing research. And to a certain extent, that's also kind of ethics. And I was wondering, also because of, maybe I read too much Foucault, that...
There's no such thing.
No, but it's also kind of criticizing this, like activism in academia is actually to question the truth of and the discourses that you're working within. And activism, political activism, needs to happen somewhere else because it needs to happen in big groups with other people, and it follows a completely different dynamic. And if you join activist groups like that as a scientist, you have to cease to be a scientist and become part of the movement. But maybe that's more kind of like a romantic kind of movement thinking of activism, but it also brings back a little bit, I think, about what we were talking about earlier today, from where does change happen? What can bring about change? One thing is what we are doing every day, but then it's when we see the camps, the students camping for Gaza, is building up a mass movement against the atrocities that is happening in Palestine. Will that make a difference as the student camps against Vietnam did, right? And what is our relationship to that as researchers? We also have this school uprising against climate change, the school strike for climate, Greta Thunberg kind of like leading on. There was a mass movement that somehow died out in a sense, but yeah, some is living. And then, of course, you have this Roads Must Fall in South Africa and these kind of like mass and student movements. Is that where change is happening much more than in our work, or do we work differently?
Maybe I can I'll have a short follow-up and pass to you. And I think that this idea of science, either things being normative, and then we deal with this a lot in transition studies, right? Is there a normative goal? I think that comes from this idea of neutrality, and neutrality is a myth, and social scientists know this, and natural scientists should read social science, and they'll find out. Even in natural science, there's our perception of things and how much you can test, and then the truth is something that you don't sort of make objective claims about without some caveats, right? So I think in social science, one is very much aware that one is in the world and of the world and studying the world, and so any kind of forced separation is only a sort of a part of a heuristic. It's fine for the sake of argument, but let's not forget ourselves. Mm-hmm. And then I think if we're good at educating society sufficiently to not stymie debates with these claims being leveled of, you're an activist, so you're not being scientific there, then we can move to some of the things that power doesn't want us to talk about, saying there are some basic things we can agree upon that don't necessarily need science to speak for. Should we do right by people? Right being just giving people a basic ability to live and do the things they love and not have to go hungry, not go without health care, that we can mobilize resources for a society. So this is, of course, stuff that you have written very powerfully about and where you have lots to say, so I'd rather just pass the word to you instead of trying to do that.
You have raised so many questions now. I have to. Maybe I just pick one in line with what Siddharth was sharing with us. It's science, quote unquote, and activism, quote unquote. I have this friend called Felwin Sarr, who is an economist. He will be giving a talk in Oslo on the 18th of June. He was trained as an economist, econometrist, I think, somebody dealing with, figures, quantities, and all of that. And he's also a poet, and then he's also a musician. He's like Paul. They are into music. And him and I, we set up a few years ago in Dakar in Senegal, an intellectual platform called Les Ateliers de la Pensée, where we brought together once a year a number of African and diasporic intellectuals with as a goal to try to rethink not only Africa's position in the world. You have in mind, I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois, the title of his book, which was on the screen this morning, Africa and the World. So the idea was to pick up that old question, which we inherited from those generations, and add to that the question of the world seen from Africa, because most of the times the world has been looking at us, and we have hardly ever looked at the world from where we are. So how do we make sure that we not return the gaze, but really take seriously the idea that we are all responsible of that we have to discharge, Africa has to discharge part of its responsibility in relation to the world. It has to carry its part of the burden of carrying the world, caring for it, repairing it, sharing it, etc. So we set up that thing, and writers would come, artists would come. There was no such space in the continent, so it began to attract lots of people. Would have hundreds of people who would come to the events. And then big discussion, but this is purely intellectual, it's academic. What we want is action. We want action. We are tired of all these theoretical discussions. We don't eat it. Do we eat it? Can it feed us? Doesn't feed us, so useless. So we started thinking about this, what is the relationship between the kind of, should I say, knowledge, the kind of discourse, whatever you want to call it, we are producing. When Alema Banku writes a novel, what is the relationship between that novel and the actual life of people on the ground? Is it that theory is already or can already be taken in and of itself as a form of the political? Or do we need to get out of our spaces in universities and all that and go and be an actor somewhere else? So it's a discussion that is ongoing. I'm sure that it has been ongoing for a long time and keep going on. Now you mentioned Rhodes Must Fall and the whole decolonial movement in South Africa. There, it's a different configuration, because it seems to me that part of the decolonial movement understood then, that was 5-6 years ago, that activism begins where one is. And in this case, the idea was to transform, here we go again with transformation, to transform the university, to take seriously this institution as a site of the political, as a site of struggles having to do with the broader society. And Sarah is the one who has been working on these issues of the critical studies of the university. We can talk about it. But it seems to me that it's a debate that is, of course, extremely important, but one way of resolving it is you work where you are. You try to take seriously the institutions you inhabit, and you change them. You change them by injecting in these institutions the forms of intelligence which are produced elsewhere. It's not science. I'm not a scientist. I have never really used that term. I don't know why.
Well, academic practice, perhaps, and there you touch so many lives. You touch lives you never know you touch because they meet you through your work, and then you touch lives because you teach them or you work with them, and in a sense, if as academics our world is the university or different research institutions, then being sort of a good person within them is also a way of working with the world in humble ways and in small ways, modest change, but they're nonetheless people and lives we touch and things that then are carried forward in ways that one might never find out.
Also, in the case of university, there was a side of protagonism. Because I can't remember who was talking about social movement. It's you talking about social movement. You struggle. I mean, this is a fight. It's not you fight. The university is a side of a fight, and you make alliances. I think Ola, who was talking this morning about how to move from, let's say, self-secluding identities to enlarging one's alliances, making coalitions, solidarity, and all that. I guess there is something there, a pedagogy there of transformation, which we haven't maybe paid much attention to, but it exists.
So I would draw a fine but important distinction there, where I think when one pushes for certain kinds of change, an academic role allows for also then to zoom out of that and look at what is happening and define it in somewhat dispassionate terms as what is this about? Is it about different relations of accountability? This is the normative base on which one could argue for this commitment, right? That is a role that we can play from within academia to spell out what that means and why it should be so.
But I also think like the Rose Must Fall movement, it is also a way of changing the institution from within, right? And I also think that's what you're doing to a certain extent when you use this poetry to talk about your research. It is like a different way of changing things from within, but it opens up for new ways of thinking and possibilities and stuff like that, right? But when you were commenting on the Rose Must Fall in an article a long time ago, you also point out that decolonization is not enough in the sense that we need a different curriculum. Of course, we need to get rid of this monstrous statue of Cecil Rhodes outside of UCT, and that happened was a spectacular moment. But also that we need to kind of like get out of this neoliberal regulation of the university that we're all part of. So it's also part of global economic politics. So it's the way we're thinking. But yeah, you were also we're kind of like discussing with you here because you brought up this kind of like mass movements. But I was also, because when people criticize Greta Thunberg, I kind of, I can't do that. And then I was thinking, because you were also pointing to that was kind of like an authoritarian kind of claim, this kind of listen to science. So when activism then fight for people not to kind of like do things, but to listen to science, then we get a different kind of authoritarianism in here. And I thought that was, yeah, it was somewhat, I've been thinking about that since you said it. So I was wondering if you have been thinking about that too, of course. And you also said it was authoritarian to say that, oh, you should panic, but in some way we should panic, right? Isn't to panic part of kind of coming to terms with needing change? That first you panic, and then you sit down, and then you think, and then you get into a mode of hope or faith, as I used to like to call it, to kind of do stuff, a resignation that opens up for action or something like that. So I don't know if you got the same thing. Sorry for bringing you into the discussion from the front row here.
I think to take that particular call to listen to the science on the big picture with the very clear scientific consensus on human activity causing climate change that we need to nip, not in the bud because that ship has sailed, but that we need to bring down rapidly, massively. I think it's a fine call to say, let's listen to the science, that we need to stop emitting this volume of greenhouse gases, this rapidity, right? I think when you get more nuanced, then we need coalition building. We need different kinds of voices. We need many people in the room and a large room and an inclusive space, and to decide together. And I think their forms of co-production are very important. So one of the things I'm really happy about this week is that a work of co-production with a poem and an artist called Margrethe Brekke, with whom I've collaborated over the years. Her work is put up at NGFM in one of the main buildings of the university, where it will stay for some years. And that is taking forward 3 years of many people's work around urban energy transitions across different sectors through a form of expression that is not within my grasp. It's not a medium that I work in, but it's something that's doing work of a sort, and it's doing something to the very elegant space of a university cafeteria and building that hopefully, as you say, leads to different sort of ontologies within learning spaces. I think that's a little bit the same when it comes to the climate movement, and I've been doing some research around who is part of these movements, what draws them in, and it's a very diverse space. So I think it's important to also see that as a space of learning and engagement, and not be too quick to judge and use broad brushstrokes, because these are people. Greta Thunberg, I met her and her father coming down the hill from a hike while I was going up some years ago, and Greta Thunberg is just a person, and a young person who's been thrust into the limelight and has handled it enormously well. I think saying sort of big things about such and such role that such and such person plays is a bit just out of place. There's many people who've systematically used very powerful podia for terrible things. And in a sense, I can't be bothered to criticize somebody who's done far more good than bad, and who's mobilized people in a direction that's far wiser than stupid. Let's discuss the fine-grained bits of it without making it about a person, even though the person symbolizes.
Yeah, we shouldn't use the person. We should the sign, because I have been blocking traffic myself, carrying around a sign saying "Listen to science now," kind of. Because but I get the point that, because that is such a big issue, I think, today, is that all the scientific evidence we have for a climate catastrophe being right around the corner and already happening a lot of places. And there seems to be so difficult to do anything about it, even though everyone, as it was also pointed out, really want to do something about it. The UN want to do something. It's kind of like a mainstream thing that we want to do something with it. And still, we don't manage to do something. We bomb each other instead. And I think, like, what's happening here? What's going on here?
Maybe that's why what he was saying, that's not enough to know. You need people who mobilize in order to make sure that what we know is indeed put into practice. But as you were asking questions, I kept wondering, what is science, and to what extent is it that science is not just whatever form of knowledge? What is it that people know? In my own father, he owned a farm in a village not far from the capital city of Cameroon, which is Yaoundé, where I was born. And I used to spend a lot of time in that farm, in a peasant community with a number of people, most of whom had never gone to school. They couldn't read. But it didn't mean that they didn't know a lot. In fact, they knew a lot. What they knew, was it scientific? Can we qualify what they knew as scientific or not? We might want to go into that. But the fact is that they knew a lot. And in fact, they seem to know more than they needed. That you know so many things, most of which you really don't need. But you enjoy them for the sake of knowledge, for the sake of knowledge. And then they knew a lot that allowed them to deal with the everyday encounter with their material existence and their spiritual existence, because there are many dimensions of what it means to be alive. Many different needs which emerge out of your, in the course of your life, in the conduct of your life, day by day. Insecurities here, risks there. How do I attend to it? I was talking about falling ill, and then you go to the diviner, and the diviner asks you, okay, but who have you been quarreling with, etc. All of that. They need to know that. And there are some people within the community who are experts in small bits and pieces of the general ecology of knowledge. So, I mention all of this because when we focus on science, we tend to, especially in experiences of so-called development, we marginalize entirely all these knowledges which people have relied upon in order to, make their habitat livable. We come, we intervene, we destroy a lot, and then we leave. And we come back 5 years later, priorities have changed, nobody has been consulted, we put money into it, one day we decide that, okay, that's enough, etc. So people have not moved, they have been there, they have seen all of these interventions coming and going from the colonial period on, and have devised mechanisms to cope with that. So how do we take all of this into account and put all of this into confrontation with so-called scientific knowledge in order to produce, let's say, the best mechanisms for the work of transformation, but at a deeper level, is clearly a question, at least in development circles, that is still unresolved.
So then you have the development kind of like thinking, and then you have like what leaders at the top level in the Western world is doing, because they don't listen to science, and or maybe they do, but that's somewhat a different problematic, but maybe they are more intertwined than we think. It's kind of that we need to think about different kinds of knowledge and try to kind of like distinguish between different kinds of knowledge and work with them, as you do with poetry, and you do with poetry and music, and I actually did too. But is that where you're trying to head? Is this kind of like
yes,
the archive
that's where that is the whole ecology of knowledges, of which science is part of, and that unless we put science in conversation with the other forms of expertise and know-how a community has, then we are not going very far.
Instead of just grabbing the land and patenting like the knowledge and selling it, which has often happened too when people work with different, because like eating herbs, for example, different kind of herbs and berries, I mean, they're so super healthy. So then they patent this kind of like thing,
you
and
have
then
too.
You have
that
it's
too,
so
yes.
extractive, right?
Oh, totally extractive. And we see it, I mean, especially in the Amazon, in the Congo Basin, the effort by capital, once again, to privatize, you see, the how should I call it, what pertains really to the realm of the commons, the commons really in the most expansive sense possible.
I think that, to me, it takes us back to your point of departure in the morning symposium around, opening up different archives of knowledge, and there's vast, the human experience is vast and diverse in that respect. But I also think that that's really a project of meaning making. Community is something we create together. We serve as resources for each other, so it's a very different logic at work than that extractive, commodifying kind of approach to, well, that's nice, let me have it. And then let me see if others want it, what I can get out of them. And it's, of course, not just people. My mother loves looking at birds, and she's over time developed a fantastic set of photographic skills and then shares that to her own little community. So I get a sense of her day in the Himalayas through, this thing being channeled through, various data flows. And what that does is connect me, and in various forms like that, all of us, to different human experiences in a way that today I think is qualitatively different than a couple of decades ago. We live in a datafied, digitalized world that's, I'm not going to say ubiquitous because there's, big shades of difference there, but it's the trend is in that direction. And that also means that there's much less of certain kinds of human interactions, of standing at a bus stop waiting and chatting with somebody, because they're checked out. They have their earphones and their mobile phone, right? And most likely so do you. And so community becomes something that doesn't physically, socially obtain in the same way that it did. This is also a generational shift in different ways. People get together in a way that's different to 2000 and to 1980. I mean, in the 90s, I remember my first reference to South Africa is the Friendship Series that we played in India, the first tournament after apartheid when they were welcomed back into the cricketing world. So, and I was born in '88, so I wasn't very old, but I remember that distinctly as the first thing I associate with the country. And that was something you did in the 90s in India, sat in front of a television screen and bonded over cricket, right? I think how we bond, the ways we connect to people, that's core to opening up those archives. And I think it also includes archives that we might have a distaste for, archives of those who don't share our values. So I sat in a room with very important people a couple of months ago that we'd invited in together to discuss the massive rollout of solar energy in Western India in the desert. And we were faced with people who had been very instrumental in the way it's done, saying, it's just a bunch of trees, referring to the sacred trees. It's just some people who are, camel herders, who are nomadic users of land over generations, and saying, what does it matter that we shove them all aside? This is the best place to build solar. We need to do it rapidly. We have targets. It was being confronted with a totally different way of valuing or discarding. Yeah. And I think if we then don't include those archives, then we are not doing our full job as people interested in that question of plurality, of multiple epistemologies. Some of them are difficult and troublesome and troubling, and I think, Haraway and staying with the trouble is part of our task.
I have so many more questions. I'm sorry about that, but we have little time left, and I want also to open for the audience, although I can't see the audience, but maybe a person with a mic can see the audience. I think there's someone in the back. Yeah, you have a microphone that you can. Was there someone who wanted to say something, or are we just signaling here at the audience?
I just have one question, and I've been all day since the morning thinking about it, and I think this is the right place, because we are in the literature house, and you've been talking about compassion, empathy, and of course sympathy, and I've been thinking about the reflections of Kundera about the different meanings of compassions based on different linguistic families. But bringing this to to political science or social science in a certain sense, besides literature, I've been thinking about, should we bring, whether we call it compassion, empathy, or sympathy, to materialize these principles in the democratic and governance structures, considering also that these meanings also have certain religious or dogmatic domains, and how should we actually translate all these structures and the meanings of this that are very different, by the way, into the at least to resolve this all the challenges of this catastrophic, apocalyptic, autocratic state, but also proliferation of war that we talk about all the day. So, just thank you.
Do you want to say something to that? Or do you want to say something to that?
Go ahead.
I don't have an immediate response.
But why don't we ask Paul, since Paul is the one
Yes, we will ask Paul. Yeah, no, but there's so many we have. Yeah, compassion, sympathy, solidarity, empathy.
Paul and Nasrin were the ones who introduced that.
Survivability.
So they should remain with us, the trouble they caused.
Because, but there's so many. What I find difficult with a lot of these terms is that they inscribe some sort of hierarchy, that there is someone who is empathetic towards someone, that someone is sympathetic towards something. And it is a privilege to always be in this position where you can have compassion and stuff like that. And there's always someone who is in that position where they need to have like understanding and compassion and empathy. And I think there might be different ways of getting around that, but that's why I kind of like the word solidarity better, but you might get into exactly the same problem with the word solidarity too. It's difficult to get around and kind of like think about all these different terms. But I think when you are talking a lot about the in common, I think maybe that's a good way to go to look at it. And I guess Paul has been the one who's been thinking a lot to that too. La tout monde, the whole world, right? Being in common with everything, which is a different way of going into that than having empathy or having sympathy or being solidaric. I don't know if you want to say. I don't know if that touched on your question, but it was really complicated.
There's always a good academic answer, which is very short and simple. It depends.
It depends.
And I think it's a way of saying that that these things need to be contextualized, and that sense-making is not about big principles, but about situated analysis and then discussion, and perhaps we come to a place of understanding through those specifics. But I do think solidarity is more action-oriented than sympathy. To me, I feel there's a risk with sympathy that we develop a relationship that borders on the condescending, if we render that a permanent relationship. And in that sense, empathy is a deeper, more immediate connection and a more equal one. And we're not always in a position to be able to have empathy, because I can't know the question, who is my neighbor? If I haven't gone through the things you've gone through, there might be bridges I cannot build and reach across in an authentic enough way. And their solidarity can mean doing something that acts out of sympathy, perhaps in the absence of empathy, but not just sort of letting things be as they are. I don't know if that's entirely true, but I've put it out there, so feel free to disagree.
So on this cluster of, because they're all clusters, or it's a cluster around identification. So whether it's sympathy, empathy, compassion, they're all words or concepts that indicate an openness to identifying with the plight of the other. Martha Nussbaum has spent much of her career arguing that compassion is necessary to citizenship. You cannot be a good citizen if you are not compassionate. Because when a government asks you to pay taxes, to provide health care, to people who are not your family. Only compassion will make you pay. Of course, there are also sanctions for not paying. will make you pay the taxes, so that compassion is, and of course, she derives the whole model from a careful analysis of classical sources, of tragedies, and so on. Because the thing is that without compassion, we become subhuman in our capacity to identify with things that are completely distant from us, and also anticipating. Because I think part of the compassionate infrastructure has to be to anticipate that if we took this decision, it will harm people that we do not even know, and that it is necessary to actually safeguard our general humanity, to work on those anticipations. So I think the cluster of concepts, empathy, sympathy, compassion, is all about the preparedness to identify with the plight of the other. And sometimes it also has to be anticipatory. So it's not you wait for it to happen and then you deliver charity. So you wait for a problem to happen and then you deliver. So the earthquake in wherever, in Turkey, Istanbul, and then there's always, just go and help them, which is not a bad thing. But it's more profound than that. It has to also be anticipatory of a world that will cause harms if it's not corrected now.
But I still think there is a possibility to just change that whole compound with like a term like Ubuntu, which is a completely different way of conceptualizing what it means to be a being in the world, right? So we are not separate. It's not like you have to have a compassion for another individual. We are, and which I think is also at the base of your thinking in common. Or am I wrong? Is it more about compassion?
What, Ubuntu?
No, you're thinking about the in common, the being in common. I'm thinking about like Ubuntu as a way of kind of conceptualizing that, but which is different from compassion. Although I also like I like the idea of being compassionate.
It's an orientation. Compassion is an always already orientation. So you are oriented to identify with the sufferings of another, and that orientation makes you sensitive at all times. It's an orientational question.
But we're actually over time, and I'm afraid I'm never going to get a job like this anymore if I just continue talking. But it's, we could go on forever, and thank you for all the good kind of like inputs also from the audience. But please give our laureates a really big hand. Thank you much. No later than 15.
Thank you for the